Connor Kenway holds an interesting place in the hearts of the fans of classic Assassin's Creed. His character has many detractors and ardent defenders alike, marking perhaps the first true controversial game among the franchise. In many ways, he represents some of the earliest formula deviation that the games underwent, and with that, a gameplay style that is far more brutal and bold than we have come to expect from the more clandestine origins of the franchise. But with any disputes as to the quality of Assassin's Creed 3 set aside, I would like to delve into the aesthetic elements of the protagonist by reimagining him in a more historically accurate context. As it happens, Native American apparel, especially that of post-colonial integration, is some of my favorite historical fashion I've ever come across in my research. There's a misunderstanding, I think, regarding what natives wore during this time in the eyes of the general public, and Assassin's Creed 3 is no exception when it comes to misrepresenting history. It's my belief that things like authentic tailoring, garment silhouette, and period-accurate material choice make a world of difference when it comes to conveying what characterizes the style of a specific period. So, let's take a look at some history and make a redesign for Connor that portrays a more authentic look, purely for the fun of experimentation. But before we get started on our redesign, I wanted to offer up some analysis on what we see in the original game. I don't really have my finger on the pulse of the Assassin's Creed community's overall opinions on the matter, but from what I gather, a lot of people really like the aesthetics of Connor, specifically his iconic assassin's robes. His outfit certainly has a lot going on. The tailoring of the coat almost mimics the shape of an eagle perched atop a branch, an intentional design choice, I'm sure, given the eagle's connection to the Brotherhood as well as its representation of the American Revolution. I can certainly understand the appeal of his outfit. They have a sort of tactical, colonial operative vibe to them. However cool as they may look, historically accurate, they are not. If I had to critique the design from a purely aesthetic angle, I would reference the disconnect between the stereotypical native elements clashing with the overly adorned colonial elements. His leggings look nothing like the style worn at the time. They look more like unfitted scraps tied on his legs, the sort you would expect from a caveman. The fringe is also a bit long and out of place for this region and era. In sharp contrast, his upper body is full to bursting with layered lapels, contrasting trim, buttons and cuffs, and other embellishments that exceed even some of the dressiest military uniforms of the region. With a few random feathers and native bands layered on top, the final appearance looks a bit mix-matched in a way that results in an overall aesthetic that is very difficult to pin down. Regarding Connor's equipment, his weapons and assassin's tools, much of what we see seems plausible, but I think we are due for a couple of changes here as well. His gear includes weapons true to the period, like the bow and tomahawk, as well as some kit that isn't accurate to the region, like the berserk poison and the Chinese-influenced rope darts. Ultimately, I want the redesign to have a far more authentic representation of the style of colonial and eastern woodland attire of the setting of the American Revolution, and so I'll need to start at the fundamental elements of period tailoring, creating a result that may differ drastically from the style over substance approach of the game developers. Before I delve too deeply into historical clothing analysis, I would like to preface that I am no expert on fashion history of any period, let alone the eastern woodlands Haudenosaunee nations of the late 18th century. My only real goal is to make a design for Connor that is more authentic to what we would expect from a half-English, half-First Nations Brotherhood assassin. I would never claim that anything I design has 100% historic validity, nor would I necessarily want it to. Some concessions will still be made in the pursuit of style and adherence to the classic Assassin's Creed tropes we've come to expect. Now, according to the game, Connor, named Radun Hagedun by his mother, was born into Mohawk society, so obviously we are primarily going to be looking into the clothing of this group. However, Connor is also an assassin of the Brotherhood, an organization known for its emphasis on individuality. Therefore, the final design won't be meant to represent the Mohawk people as a whole, only Connor as an individual. I know that in-game, Connor receives his outfit from his mentor Achilles, but for the purpose of this redesign, I want to emphasize more of the native elements, and we'll just assume that it's something he had crafted for himself. Anyway, with caveats out of the way, let's look at some history. When researching historical artifacts of any kind, I often find it most helpful to look at what reenactors are doing, as they not only talk about the items in detail, but engage with it in a hands-on manner. I've come across a number of these reenactors on YouTube, and they've been invaluable in my research, so I'll try and link them below and reference their videos on screen when relevant. I mentioned earlier that post-contact Native American clothing is very interesting to me personally. The reason for this is the fascinating interweaving of European materials and indigenous patterns. You see, when wool and steel came to the Americas via European settlers, the native inhabitants adopted them quite readily. Contrary to the common idea of a native clad in animal skins, by the time of the American Revolution, most of the eastern woodland tribes were primarily wearing linen and wool textiles. Leggings were tailored in a manner similar to the split pair of hose we see in early medieval clothing. Wool is actually good at wicking away moisture and keeping the body cool, so long as we aren't talking about coarse-knit modern sweaters. Native Americans would often wear the same linen shirts as white settlers, although they tended to prefer more interesting patterns, and ruffed collars would be left worn open much of the time. The shirts were usually left untucked and belted like a tunic, covering the upper thigh, which was usually left exposed from the disconnected leggings. There are a variety of adornment styles on belts and garters, ranging from finger-woven patterns to extremely meticulous bead and quill work. Metals like silver, iron, and pewter became common in their society, especially in jewelry like bracelets, earrings, and gorgets. Pins and brooches were also affixed onto the fabric of other garments. Straps, garters, and tumplines, in addition to moccasins, were the primary elements of apparel that typically remained crafted out of the traditionally tanned deer hide or other animal leathers. Hollywood and fantasy media often portray pre-industrial garments in a manner that makes them look ramshackle or otherwise scrapped together. In reality, just because a group is crafting with local subsistence materials like hides, it doesn't mean tailoring standards aren't high. Materials may be different, but intricate patterns, form-fitting comfort, and meticulous precision are always valued regardless of the era or ethnicity. Ultimately, 18th century Eastern woodland clothing had the elements of the highest and the middling quality of both the colonial style as well as the traditional crafts passed down through their people's ancestry. It's this merging of styles along with the jewelry and accessories worn by the Haudenosaunee that creates a look that is so appealing to me. It sort of reminds me of pirates or other mercenaries. There is a sort of rough-and-ready vibe that combines with a regal confidence in the drapery of Native American clothing that I want to incorporate into my design for Connor's warrior-assassin aesthetic. Now that we're ready to begin painting, I would like to start by illustrating the individual components of Connor's kit to help flesh out the full design. Perhaps the most significant challenge when designing a period-accurate assassin is what to do about the hood. Hoods are uncommon in many periods in history, and the Assassin's Creed games don't typically make an effort to justify them in accordance with period-appropriate garments. One interesting First Nations garment of the era is a large rectangle of cloth called a match coat. Worn in many different configurations, this cloak could double as a blanket or be draped over the shoulder and wrapped about the waist. They were often made of wool and adorned with stripes of silk ribbon or embroidered patterns. Connor could wear this garment over the head and shoulders like a hood if pinned at the neck, and if he needed to appear less assassin-y, he could remove it and drape it over his shoulder in a more dressy fashion to fit in with civilians. His overall clothing configuration would mostly resemble the native style I outlined earlier, but a waistcoat would be worn to add pockets and fit in more with city dwellers. His leggings would be worn over colonial breeches to blend better with white customs as well. Moccasins would still be a great choice given their muffled movement, but he would wear a custom pair that laced up the length of the ankle to provide better support when free-running and prevent any chance of them coming off in a hectic moment. Sashes and belts would be worn with a style of bag that folds over top. This would conceal his pistol and any other loose items that may be useful. I would imagine Connor wouldn't want to carry a full cartridge set and powder horn unless deep in the wilderness, as they might draw too much attention. There are a couple of other pieces that have important relevance to Eastern woodland culture that Connor would want to adopt as part of his kit as well. These include the gorget and the wampum belt. A gorget is a type of pendant worn around the neck that typically represented an idea or affiliation important to the wearer, likely worn over the throat to evoke that the wearer speaks on behalf of a certain cause. Before contact with Europeans, natives made these out of a variety of different types of shell. Europeans had gorgets as well, inspired from the original piece of plate armor with the same name. They would wear them with military uniforms, and they had a sort of horseshoe shape and were made of metal. This style was widely adopted by Native Americans, who would decorate them with their own motifs. Connor could use one of these as a means of tying his match coat around his collar. It would display the Brotherhood symbol for the instances when he needs to represent their interests publicly. Wampum belts are crafted of quahog clamshell beads. They have a variety of purposes ranging from diplomacy to pictographic stories, and ultimately they show the wearer's status and resolve. Wampum belts are very time-consuming to make, which makes them significant tools of showcasing one's dedication to a concept, society, or cause. Connor might want to create his own belt to communicate his dedication to the Brotherhood path he's chosen. If one of his tribe members questioned why he would choose to leave his people to pursue this new cause, he may wish to show the belt that he meticulously made himself, at no small cost, to prove his commitment. Wampum belts could be worn at the waist or affixed to straps and that sort of thing. I wanted to show him wearing his as a headband because the eagle motif mimics the triangle of the beaked hood of the Brotherhood. I'm not sure if there's any evidence of them being worn in this fashion, but other types of headbands were used, and like I mentioned earlier, Connor is not a representative of the Mohawk as much as he is a representation of his own way of life. Another fascinating piece of attire from the period that I couldn't pass up is a winter garment known as a blanket coat or capote. They are made of wool and are an actual period garment that has a hood and are frequently worn by the Haudenosaunee. A very common style of this garment that I came across in reenactment and iconography even has a white base with red piping accents in the same color scheme as the traditional Assassin's Brotherhood. Connor could even customize it by sewing a beak onto the brim of the hood and attaching a metal pendant or native brooch. As for his weapons, I think a classic tomahawk and knife are more than appropriate. The bow is a bit of a mix-up, however, as the bow had been replaced by the firearm in native warfare for over a century at this point. They were still used for hunting, however. Their use in stealth is too valuable for Connor to pass up, so he would probably make one of a simple and nondescript flat style. His quiver could be made from reeds as a sort of basket with a cap to cover the exposed fletchings. This was a style that is accurate to some of the quiver crafting methods of the time, and it has the advantage of looking discreet, as it may be easily mistaken for a case of kindling firewood or other harmless equipment. In-game, Connor can throw a poisoned knife that causes distracting fits on the guards. On a more realistic note, he may want to use a blowgun made of American river cane, which many First Nations used for hunting small game. He could dip the darts in the poison that has now become a Brotherhood mainstay. Not the sort of thing you would want to carry around all the time, though. The rope dart is a tricky thing to make colonially authentic, but there are a few videos I've seen on people testing a rope tomahawk as a means of retrieving it after a throw. This makes more sense from a logical perspective, as it would be useful for attacking at range and grappling enemies to the ground, but wouldn't be as unbelievable as the more over-the-top feats we see from the in-game rope dart. Finally, we have Connor's hidden blade. I've never been a huge fan of the retracting pivot knife we see as the in-game version, as it always came across as gimmicky and overly complicated. I've decided to give him a more standard blade with the exception of a small barb at the end, which would aid in grappling by snagging clothing during a fight and bringing an opponent down. Not to mention the resulting wounds would be more grievous as well. With the components figured out, now we can get started on a pose for the final configuration. Connor is a man with many motives and contradictions. He is one of the most reserved and calm-tempered of the AC protagonists, and yet he is one of the most brash when it comes to the physicality of his combat and moveset. He is one of the less outwardly charismatic assassins, yet he is often involved directly in historic events, constantly speaking personally with the most influential leaders of the time. I have my misgivings about some of the story elements of Assassin's Creed 3, but in my redesign I want to make a character that encapsulates what I like most about the character in a way that respects the premise of who he is and what he works toward. Even when I deviate from the original concept, I want the overall vibe of Connor to remain intact. He should look like a man unwillingly placed as a mediator between the traditions of his people and the new American civilization being erected during the Revolution. A man who seeks personal liberty for all, yet is ironically forced to aid and represent many differing ideas and conflicting groups, tragically unable to unshackle himself from a cause he never really got to choose. I hope you've enjoyed my process as well as the final design. If you have any thoughts or critiques on what I've made, or have any corrections to my historical analysis, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. I really enjoy these Assassin's Creed redesigns as they act as an excellent means of combining historical constraints and functional styles with a sort of fictional embellishment. If you also find this sort of thing interesting, I've already made a historically authentic redesign of Ezio from Assassin's Creed 2, so be sure to check that out if you're interested. Stay tuned for more fantasy and historical redesigns on a variety of topics in the future. Thank you for watching.